Greetings and welcome to the Strategic Dialogue on Violence and the Coronavirus. We are here this afternoon to talk to two preeminent experts that work on conflict monitoring, global trends, and we'll get into that conversation in just a moment. I think before we start, I would very much like to acknowledge and thank the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs for bringing us together. They've been a co-host with CIPRI for the Stockholm Forum. This is the 7th year of the Stockholm Forum. And although we miss very much welcoming you all to Stockholm and having the conversations that we have, we very much appreciate the energy and effort that has been put into bringing us all together. I particularly would like to acknowledge the work of Martina Selmy and Jago Salman in convening this global group of experts. I have the most recent statistics because I enjoy statistics very much. 2,500 participants are registered for the forum. We have a wait list of 1,000, and I'm very sorry for those that we still are trying to get in. We will as we can. There are 41 partners for this forum, and we have representatives from over 80 countries registered for the forum. So this is a global conversation, and in some ways, a more global conversation than we've been able to do in the past. We don't have the problems with visas. We don't have the problems with airport travel. And we have many, many people joining this conversation, including through the T-Web interface, for those of you that are registered. And I do want to, before we go into the conversation, acknowledge that Caroline Delgado, our senior researcher from CIPRI and part of the GReVD initiative, is monitoring the questions that will be coming in there. And I have on another screen those questions coming to me. So we may be able to incorporate those into the conversation as well. Before we get to that discussion, that question and answer, I think what's brought us here together is having a framing conversation about what the impacts of COVID are, the coronavirus are, and how we will understand violence and disorder better in this current environment. And it's really, really useful to have this on the first day of the forum because we are able to have this conversation and use the evidence and statistics that our experts coming to us today will share with us. And I hope that these will be the foundation, they will be the basis for the discussion over the next 2 weeks. So I'm very much very happy to have Robert Muggah here. He's the principal for SecDev Group and the co-founder of the Igarapé Institute. And Clionadh Raleigh, she is the executive director for the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, ACLED. Both Igarapé and ACLED are members of the GReVD Consortium. We'll talk a little bit more about the GReVD Consortium later. We have many experts within the network, but I'm particularly delighted to have these two here because Rob and Clionadh monitor these global trends and are able to bring together a lot of evidence, a lot of data. They monitor these data sources from a variety of different sources. And they're able to put it together into a succinct way for policymakers to understand extremely complex, many, many data layer problems into much more approachable understandings and give us a common narrative. So I won't go too much into the trends because we have the experts here. We're going to ask them. But here we are. We are now 3-4 months into the coronavirus. We've seen protests, we've seen oppression, we've seen attacks against journalists. We've also seen ceasefires. We are seeing a variety of global trends that have changed the world. And so we really want to have a better understanding of it. And I'm going to turn first to Rob Muggah. He's going to do a presentation. I'm going to give you each 15 minutes. I'm going to be strict and make sure that we come back at the end of those 15 minutes so that we can keep the conversation going. But Rob, can you give us an overview of the global trends and just lay it out for us? What are we seeing is happening? What do we know right now?
Thanks so much, Gary. And let me simply say it's a pleasure to be here with you all virtually. I'm sorry we're not there physically. We missed that contact. And let me also echo Gary in thanking the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and CIPRI and all of the extraordinary work that's been done here. But let me start with a bit of a bang, which is obvious, and it's that we're currently experiencing the most dangerous political and economic shock in a century. And the COVID crisis is revealing that fragility is much more widely distributed than we often assumed. It's in our inner cities, it's in our secondary cities, it's in wealthy countries, it's in poorer ones. And COVID is revealing and exposing in a way the tattered state of the social contract around the world, the quality of governance, the reach of safety nets, and all the rest. And for the very few among those who are listening today who believe we've hit rock bottom, I've got some bad news. The world is probably going to get more volatile and unstable. But what we do next, that is to say, what we do next in the next couple of months and years, will have generational consequences. So what you should see in front of you is a slide of COVID, and the famous slide from JHU, Johns Hopkins University. How bad are things right now? At this moment, there are 4.1 million people infected. Over 280,000 people who have died in 187 countries. It's changed since last night when I put this slide together. The excess death toll is probably an order of magnitude higher than that. More than 2.4 billion people are in lockdown. Over 80% of the world's workers are impacted in one way, shape, or form. And the epicenter of the pandemic, and this is critical, is moving in many ways from the northern to the southern hemisphere. This thing is just a couple of months old, and we've barely started. Epidemiologists think that we're going to be hit by several waves, potentially later ones more devastating than the ones we've already experienced. Harvard modelers think that between 40 and 70% of all adults will be infected by 2021. And making matters worse, this virus, as many of you who are following this closely know, has mutated hundreds of times. And a chorus of scientists now worry that the vaccines that are being developed today that may become available in the next 12, 18 months, if we're lucky, will be useless against the virus when they finally come to market. So the reality here is that no one knows what comes next. International relations scholars are fearing that COVID-19 is accelerating geopolitical tensions and decoupling between China and the US. And this could make a military confrontation more likely. Economists believe that a Great Depression is on the way, one that would actually exceed what we saw in the 1930s. Last week, the IMF described the global situation as the biggest global financial crisis in over 100 years. And development experts are worrying about inequality and poverty becoming deeper, wiping out decades of work, especially for the 60% of the world's population who depend on the informal economy. They also know that in a virtual world, the business model for development will have to change, and that local ownership isn't just desirable, it's probably the only way forward moving ahead. The next slide is of the Spanish flu, and the most important question I want to talk right now about is how long? How long until we have a vaccine or adequate antivirals or herd immunity? We're struggling through Act 1 right now, but the truth is that Act 2 could be dramatically worse than the present one. And it's worth recalling that Act 1 of the Spanish flu, that little bump you see there between June and July 1918, killed over 5 million people. But far more damaging was Act 2 and Act 3, and later in 1918 and 1919, when tens of millions of more people died. It's not 1918 or 1919, but I think it bears, it's worth keeping this in mind. Next slide. So on to the questions for today's talk. What will be the impacts of COVID-19, including state and non-state measures to contain it or exploit it, on conflict, fragility, and violence? Will we see increasing or decreasing security? I'm going to offer a few generic reflections on these questions. I know Clionadh is going to go deep, and then a few thoughts on what we might do to improve things. So the short answer to the first question, COVID-19 increased fragility, conflict, is okay, yes and no. There are going to be differential effects depending on the type of violence, the ways in which government and non-state actors respond, and the period of time that we're considering. And before jumping into just explaining this a bit more, 3 obligatory caveats. First, as everyone listening knows, there are big data gaps when it comes to tracking fragility and violence. The problems are legion and well known, including things like time lags and reporting biases and categorization problems. The good news is that we have incredible groups like ACLED, PRIO, UCDP, and of course GReVD, among others, working to fix these. The second big caveat is that there are big theoretical gaps when it comes to parsing out the relationships between pandemics and violence. We know a fair bit about how organized violence affects the spread of infectious diseases like cholera or Ebola or TB, but there's a lot less written about the other direction, how pandemics impact on patterns of organized violence. So in a way, we're imputing relationships here. The third caveat is that we need to be humble when forecasting the future. Despite extraordinary advances in machine learning, the field, and Gary can speak about this, is difficult and fraught. We can identify hotspots with a pretty high level of confidence, but predicting the exact timing of when violence will start or when escalation will occur is another matter entirely. Incredible innovation out there. People are using cell phone data and climate data, but it's still early days. So with these caveats in mind, I think it's fair to say that COVID will have mixed effects on multiple categories of violence, be it conflict or social unrest or crime or intimate partner and domestic violence. Next slide, please. Let's walk through a few possible trends in the short term. As many of you probably know, COVID-19 has actually contributed to a dampening of certain forms of violence around the world in the last couple of months. With some exceptions, we saw dramatic reductions in conflict violence, in social unrest, and in lethal criminal violence. Now, keep in mind that there's probably big underreporting here, but it's pretty dramatic. Major cities across the United States saw violent crime, virtually all forms of violent crime, go down. They often drop by double-digit percentages. And some of the world's most violent countries, be it Afghanistan or Brazil or El Salvador or South Africa, registered declines in lethal violence in the first quarter. But this is only part of the story, because during that period, we saw an explosion of reported intimate partner violence and domestic abuse. With more and more governments imposing lockdowns and curfews and shelter in place, violence against women and children appears to have actually skyrocketed. Again, there are big questions about reporting biases here that we need to be mindful of. So in the first few months of the crisis, there was hope that these recent dips might actually prelude a sustained decline. And the UN Secretary General made an incredible move, calling for the ceasefire, which initially stuck. There was also hope that governments and armed groups might see COVID as a collective disaster, much like a tsunami or an earthquake. The idea was that this might actually strengthen social bonds and encourage people to rally around their flags, lead to an outbreaking of solidarity. But the evidence of this is kind of thin. Next slide, please. The more likely scenario is that in their response to COVID-19, governments fumble the ball and make a bad situation worse. And the more disruptive and incompetent their responses, the more likely this is going to inflame grievances. The big intervening variables here right now, which I hope to talk about, are trust and legitimacy. Where there's more of it, citizens are more likely to abide by the rules and tolerate missteps. Where there's less, we can expect less compliance and possibly more unrest. Also, signs 19 could generate more government repression. We're already seeing how some governments are using the crisis as an opportunity, some intrusive surveillance, cracking down on civil liberties, curtailing independent media, deploying military and police assets, and increasing incarceration. This could be actually leading to and triggering dangerous self-fulfilling prophecies. Next slide. And it's not just states that are being opportunistic. Non-state armed groups, rebels, cartels, gangs, and militia are also seeing COVID-19 as a means to reposition and expand their influence and power. Some of them have been ramping up the supplying of services and public goods, including food aid. What you see here is relief aid with El Chapo's stenciled face being distributed in Sinaloa, Mexico. Many of these groups are keenly aware that COVID-19 could weaken governments, especially armies and police, and open up new lines of business. So what about the longer term? There's a more than decent chance that COVID-19 could increase risks of armed conflict, repression, crime, and interpersonal violence. This is more likely in countries and cities that are already affected by fragility and conflict, of course. But some of the reasons for this are economic stress and food insecurity and identity disputes, especially in settings where faith and trust between groups is already at rock bottom. I think the economic factors are probably the most dangerous. We know that low per capita income, unemployment, inequality can generate resentment and lower the opportunity costs of joining armed groups. We also know that when economies are under stress, predatory activities and looting can follow. Next slide, please. Food supply shortages are another major flashpoint. While supply chains have more or less held in the first wave of COVID-19, we can expect big disruptions in the next ones. The Food Program estimated a couple of weeks ago that over 265 million people could face acute food shortages by the end of 2020. Most of these people would be in countries already affected by conflict. And there are really compelling links in the literature between food insecurity, food price shocks, and social unrest and ultimately violence. Another big concern, this is the third in terms of the long term, is that major could be distracted. So, getting the extraordinary debt relief and the hundreds of billions of dollars being made available in concessional finance by groups like the IMF and the bank and others, it's likely that aid dollars could shrink given austerity concerns. And some of the scarcity of aid could result in the limited amount that's left being misallocated or diverted, further exacerbating grievances. Next step, please. What is especially worrying about all this is that this is happening against a backdrop of deepening geopolitical tension. The Security Council is paralyzed by the new Cold War between China and the United States. The G7 and G20 are mentioned. An even deeper problem is the declining faith in democracy. You would be excused, those listening, for missing a report that was issued early this year that showed that levels of faith in democracy are at the lowest level since the 1990s. So what we're really worried about right now are nationalist and protectionist backlashes on issues ranging from food to migration, and this would be devastating. So what governments and international organizations do next has monumental implications. Obviously, global cooperation is more urgent than ever, and this will be, I'm sure, a theme throughout the next couple of days. But to be effective, states and international agencies and NGOs, all of us, have a fragility, conflict, and violence lens in our work. We need to also double down on what works, be data-driven, and be evidence-based. Smart investments now in the billions will save us trillions in the future. So let me end with 6 priorities for minimizing fragility, conflict, and violence in the future. There's many more, and I'm looking forward to them over the course of the next couple of days. First, we've got to focus on the health emergency, but we need to be preparing for the secondary risks that may be even more disruptive and dangerous. COVID-19 will overwhelm health systems in lower, middle, and even some upper income countries. We're already seeing this in Brazil, where I'm based. Political, economic, and social fallout from the pandemic may be even worse and much more long-lasting. This means we need to act in the short term, but prepare and start acting for the long term. Second, take proportionate and balanced approaches to those health moves, be it contact tracing, isolation, quarantine, and all the rest. Government actions to contain COVID-19, they're going to fall short of expectations in many parts of the world. That's guaranteed. But when services are seen as uneven or arbitrary, they're going to trigger grievances and possibly unrest. Where support is wanting, they can unleash violence. While they need to act fast and with determination, governments must avoid top-down moves that result in discrimination, especially amongst the lowest and lower income communities. Third, monitor and minimize interventions that are going to aggravate fragility, conflict, and violence, especially against women and children. There are big subsidies that are being rolled out right now to deal with these challenges. There's enormous movements of supplies, and these are going to be exploited by armed groups and criminal actors and all the rest. But isolation and shelter-in-place measures can also unintentionally intensify the vulnerability of women and children. The old saying applies here, which everyone knows, which is to do no intentional harm, and this is more urgent than ever. Fourth, engage not just national, but also the local governments and partners on the front line. City mayors, along with faith-based leaders and civic groups, and not centralized national governments, often have much more influence in shaping COVID-19 responses and violence reduction on the ground. They're key to initiating pro-health and pro-social changes in behavior. Fifth, engage non-state actors involved in pandemic response. Many of the most vulnerable areas to COVID-19 are those with the most limited state capacity. This means engaging not just with the humanitarian development and grassroots community, but also with civic leaders, with mayors, and all the rest. It may also mean engaging time to time with rebels, gangs, and militia, some of whom are active already in the relief response. And this, of course, raises enormously tricky challenges. Finally, seize the opportunities during COVID-19 pandemic and its aftermath. Notwithstanding the tremendous pain and suffering generated by this outbreak, there are also entry points for violence prevention and reduction in the long term. A good example of that was ceasefires, though, as we found, these are extraordinarily difficult to hold, especially when you section in the Security Council and a reluctance to endorse them. But other possibilities, and I'm sure Clionadh will talk about this, include negotiating elite pacts and expanding government legitimacy through service delivery. So while there are opportunities, I have to say that the short to medium to long-term view is somewhat gloomy. There are many flashing lights ahead, and we'll be counting on the accumulated wisdom and experience of this community more than ever to safely navigate the COVID era. Thanks, Gary.
Thanks so much, Rob. That was a great overview and so much more to discuss there and unpack, and I'm sure we'll be talking about it for the next 2 weeks. I am going to turn right away to Clionadh Raleigh. She's the executive director for ACLED, and she's going to add to this the perspectives, looking at the data on violence and disorder globally, and what we're seeing coming out of the data from ACLED. Clionadh?
Great, thank you very much. I also want to, of course, thank the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Gary and his team at CIPRI. It's a great pleasure to be able to chat with you all today. So we have been collecting data for quite a while now. So the COVID pandemic has come at a time where we were actively collecting real-time data about political violence and social movements that are occurring throughout the world. And from that perspective, I can be relatively sure at this moment that what we are seeing is that the pandemic does not cause political violence by any stretch, and we wouldn't expect it to. The economic problems that will soon follow will certainly have an effect on violence, and I'll get into those details in a second. But you can see here on this slide, this is the front page of the ACLED website, there's been a decline by 17%, 15% fatality decline, and a 48% protest decline. And while the protest decline is expected because of social distancing measures, the other two numbers, the 17% and the 15% decline, are not because of the pandemic, and they're certainly not because of the very few ceasefires that have been attempted during this period. They are, in fact, because over the 12 months that we are generating these statistics, Afghanistan and Syria have, in fact, declined their activity quite a bit. And because they were the most active countries within the data, it gives an erroneous impression that, in fact, the pandemic, more so than actual geopolitical changes that have occurred within the last 12 months, have been having a massive effect on what we're seeing at the moment. In short, what we are seeing at the moment, and we'll release data today from last week to Saturday, is that actually armed organized violence has not declined. Protests certainly have, although they have been picking up as of late. Riots certainly have, again, they've been picking up as of late. But of the armed organized groups that have been active, throughout this period, for certainly longer than the pandemic, they are not using this opportunity to limit their activity. In fact, they're using it to expand their activity. And governments, while they may not necessarily be interacting with armed organized groups, such as, for example, in places where seasonality factors might limit their abilities to do so, which is typical of this time of year, they're instead using those powers against people who are still actively pursuing their livelihoods and may not necessarily be following rules. So we're seeing a shift in the modality of some of this political violence, but we're not seeing a decline. And we are not seeing that the ceasefires attempted in Yemen and elsewhere have any sort of sticking power. Armed groups love to take the opportunity. As I said recently, they never let a good crisis go to waste. And this is a perfect crisis for many groups. It means that the security services of a state may not be so active in limiting their activity, but it also means that they get a chance, as Rob noted, to expand their kind of local social legitimacy claims, although in fairness, not many groups bother with that either. So we should be very reticent in making any claims about the nature of pandemics to affect political violence. As I like to say over and over again in fora like these, politics causes political violence. Pandemics don't, poverty doesn't, state capacity doesn't. Politics does. And so the question we should ask ourselves is how we believe the pandemics will affect the politics of fragile states and how they will affect the politics of states that we currently don't necessarily deem fragile, but may in fact be. Next slide, please. One of the most important things to recall is that what we were seeing in 2019 pre-pandemic was already a very stark picture, which is that more countries experienced more violence in 2019, whereas the actual total amount of violence decreased slightly, again, because of Afghanistan and Syria. The types of violence that we saw were more widespread, which means that violence is still considered a very, very possible avenue towards political power and certainly political authority in a region. And if anything, the pandemic will exacerbate that, especially as you see states not being able to service populations very well. And as I mentioned before, either populations reacting to that, albeit through protests and social movements largely, or armed organized groups stepping in to fill that goal. Next slide, please. What we're seeing at the moment is, and we're tracking this in our COVID-19 disorder tracker, is that there's very many manifestations of how this is directly affecting countries. So we see widespread patterns like prison breaks or even prison releases. We see some attempts for the security services to retract from active conflict environments, such as in the Sahel. But we also see a number of cases where we see an increase in conflict, again, because of this ability of these groups to make significant moves at this moment. And where militaries can, they're reacting to it. But on this site, you'll be able to see both general trends, but also very specific trends. And something I'll come back to in a little bit is the role of ISIS as a really good example of an armed organized group seeking to really kind of capitalize on the position that they were in pre-pandemic, during the pandemic. And they've done so through very excessive attempts to expand their territory, both where they are, such as northern Iraq, but also into new places like that in Mozambique. And I think that should be a huge worry to people, in part because once we emerge from these kind of pandemic lockdowns, we might find a much different local geopolitics and who is in charge and who is active in conflict zones than we had pre-pandemic. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, we have a situation where we have some clear wars, which people are aware of course, Ukraine, Syria, Yemen, Nigeria, Somalia, etc., and Afghanistan. We've actually had Libya, of course, but we've actually had a complete explosion of low-level persistent conflicts. And it's occurring in places that have relatively inclusive regimes, that don't seem to have any sort of income barrier to violence, which is quite surprising. A lot of our beliefs about conflict are kind of based on the thoughts that it would happen in poorer places or places with poor governance. But what this map is showing us is, in fact, we're seeing a tremendous amount of conflict in inclusive, relatively wealthy states compared to what we did 20 years ago. And in fact, it's deeply and closely linked to the competition between elites within that system. And those elites, in many ways, are using violence to compete with each other, but it's also these are also contexts in which patronage and the fuel, if you will, of keeping authoritarianism at least ticking away, despite the kind of superficial democratic changes we might see on the surface, are really going to be impacted by economic crises. And so if we were going to try and expect what we should see as a result of economic crisis plus pandemic politics, it would be real fractures, not just in poorer countries that may not be able to meet the social needs of their citizens and rarely have, but in middle-income countries, where you not only have the inability to meet the citizens' needs, but you now also have elites being able to solidify a pact around which they can agree. And the outcome of that tends to be quite a lot more violence. And it's violence through militias rather than through these large, let's say, rebel or insurgent armies, where you would get to fight exclusion or grievance. What we're seeing is that that's really not a factor in many of these middle-income countries, of course, but it's no longer a factor in many of the low-income countries as we've integrated into the regime and made them quite inclusive. And so now they are fighting from inside rather than fighting from outside. And it has terrible ramifications for what we might see in an economic collapse when that elite pact becomes much more unstable. What we should expect to see, next slides, please, is, of course, more social movements, which is what we've been seeing for the past 18 months or so. There was a sharp break in those social movements, all of which seem to be around this notion of this creeping authoritarian state. not just a reversal of democracy, as Rob said, which has been going on for quite a while, but a recognition that, in fact, these democracies were never democracies, and in fact had been functioning like autocracies, manipulating those institutions for a decade or longer, but insisting on being called democracies, which in some ways was the fault of the Western academics and practitioners, such as myself, who wanted to believe, I think, the best in some of these transitions. But in fact, it created vulnerabilities in society that not only armed groups, some of them, of course, working for politicians, seek to exacerbate, but also something that this pandemic can exacerbate. The inequality that we're seeing laid bare is something that has been built over the years, and it certainly is not going to all of a sudden result in a highly politicized population, because it's designed specifically to not allow for that kind of activity by the population. So these social movements were quite exciting, I think. They were certainly, as you can see from the map, very, very prolific. But in terms of their actual impacts on the governments that they sought to change or replace, they were very limited, and we shouldn't think otherwise, because it put people in a lot of danger. Next slide, please. I want to bring your attention to the Latin American situation. We've just released data for that. And you can see here, of course, that cartel violence dominates the Latin American political violence scene. And in fact, state activity with the cartels is the lighter yellow in the graph below. And then, of course, just state activity in general around security is the blue. You can see that the state has all but retracted from the environments in which cartels are active. And this is a particular worry because, of course, cartels are then going to start acting like local government, albeit extremely violent versions of them. It's in part because there is no other alternative. And it may be to build legitimacy. That may be one of the outcomes of this process, but it certainly is a legitimacy that comes with deep-seated likelihood of high rates of risk and continuing violence. We've seen tremendous amounts of violence within Mexico as a result of the manufacturing recipe. I'm not a good cartel member, as you can tell. I don't necessarily know what goes into the different drugs, but a lot of the shipments from Wuhan were stopped, and so there was quite a lot of competition amongst the cartels as they sought to gain what was left of it within Mexico. And these are the kind of things we should expect constantly, and they will, in fact, be exacerbated within Latin America and elsewhere. But I put this up here because one of my main concerns about places like the Sahel, northern Nigeria, Somalia, and other places is that they are increasingly starting to look like organized crime and political violence and politics are deeply intertwined. And becoming like Somalia was always a huge threat to a lot of places, but now becoming like Mexico may in fact be an even larger threat, because we simply cannot understand what would stop the type of exacerbating violence that we're seeing within that context. And I'm going to go to the next slide and show you what else we're seeing in terms of who the most active actors are. So here again, we see militias, which in Africa may be called militias, but in Central and South America, with more of a business relationship, they may also be called cartels. But we're seeing the rise of these groups proliferate throughout the world. And they are not too concerned about how the pandemic may force them into a ceasefire. And they're certainly not concerned overly about the attending to the needs of the population. And we should be very cognizant of the fact that these are not your typical conflict actors that can sit down and do a ceasefire or do some sort of conflict mitigation strategy. That's not how this is going to work. And it's not going to work in Latin America, and it's certainly not going to work in other developing contexts as they become more fragile in their exposure both to economic detriment, but also the pandemic. Next slide, please. This is another map of where we're seeing different types of violence within African states. As you can see here, I often get much more concerned about the communal militias and the political militias, which proliferate throughout the continent, rather than the rebel groups, which are, in fairness, relatively rare and becoming more rare because the act of overtaking the state is less attractive. And now just competing for your share of territory or your share of authority is becoming much more attractive. And of course, as I mentioned before, supported by the politicians within many states, which makes me very worried about the retraction of development aid and how people who live in these countries are going to have to deal with now a violent elite settlement, possibly now a increasingly competitive elite settlement, becoming their future. I'm gonna have the next slide go on. It's a final slide about Islamist and non-Islamist actor engagement. And I show this now not to emphasize, if you will, the Islamist nature of some of the violence that's happening within developing states, but to note that some groups are much more able to be prolific and take advantage of crises than others. And certainly Islamist actors such as Al-Qaeda and Daesh have been two that have shown an incredible ability to prey on the vulnerabilities of society and to turn those vulnerabilities into the group's strengths. And we should, as I mentioned, be very aware that the conflict environments that we might see coming out of this will not look like the conflict environments we saw going into it, in which we saw a decreasing amount of violence in Afghanistan, Syria. Again, quite a lot of militia violence, a tremendous amount of cartel violence, and that militia and cartel violence starting to look like each other. There is very little reason to suspect that any sort of COVID-related response plan or elite settlements or attempts at more inclusivity or poverty alleviation are going to mitigate the incentives that these types of groups have to continue proliferating. And it may require us to rethink this notion that we have of fragility and instead be far more strategic about how we try to tackle what are continuing threats to the people who live in these countries. Thank you. That's all for me.
Thank you so much, Clionadh. That was a fantastic overview, and it gave us a lot to think about. We're going to move now into discussion, and I very much would like to hear from Rob, just a reflection on what Clionadh has just presented, and then Clionadh, a reflection on what Rob presented. And what I'm hoping we're going to get out of this is to be able to tie this together. We work with these peace builders. They're watching right now, and I admire them greatly, because this is the difficulty level set on max, trying to do development in the most fragile and complicated environments in the world. You've just laid out how difficult this is, and now we've added the pandemic on top of this. We're seeing the change in political structures on the ground, and we're seeing that it's not just poverty, it's also the pandemic and the response to the pandemic and the relationship with the state that's going to affect the manifestation of the violence. So I'm really hoping that in the course of this discussion, we can tie this together a little bit and be able to give some common narratives that people can use over the next week and a half to be able to refer to these challenges, because it's a lot. This is a huge challenge. Rob, give us a couple reflections on Clionadh's presentation and your own thinking.
Thanks, Gary, and thanks, Clionadh. So many reflections there. I think one of the things that's interesting that we're hearing across all domains, and it's reflected, I think, in what Clionadh was saying as well, is that the pandemic is, in a way, not necessarily a cause as much as a great accelerator of many of the kinds of trends that were already underway, and accentuating, in a way, some of the opportunity structures and creating new ones that I think some of the data that's collected by ACLED has already been detecting over the last little while. I would add, though, that what we're seeing here is not just the health crisis or the political response or lack of response, but also is a monumental supply and demand shock that is going to have enormous ramifications. Again, both accentuating but creating new challenges. And so to take just one, it's not just the legal supply chain that's being fragmented and the decoupling that's happening as a result, it's the illegal one as well. So we've actually been tracking at Igarapé and SecDev some of these trends in the drug markets. And what we're seeing is some of that violence that we're seeing emerging in places like Mexico and elsewhere, which is accelerating trends that were already getting out of control. I mean, this last couple of months have been some of the highest rates of homicidal violence we've seen in that country in 20 years, which is saying something. Has to do with the diminishing pie, changing consumption habits right now out there, and fighting over what is ultimately a more limited possibility in terms of profit generation. And that's going to result also in a change of behavior and a move into other markets, including older markets, which many drug cartels and organized crime groups had left, like kidnapping, more extortion, and all of the rest. So I think it's the acceleration, accentuation trend, I think, came out really clearly, and it's being reflected in some of the data. The second big observation I have from listening to Clionadh is that what COVID-19 is doing and helping us do, in a way, is reforcing us to rethink our classifications and categorizations of violence. For 50 years, we have been compartmentalizing the different types of violence into different baskets. We have armed conflicts, and the dirty little secret of armed conflict, of course, is that there's no legal definition. It's an arbitrary sociological definition about a certain number of deaths and a certain number of actors and a certain relationship between state and non-state groups. But we're also rethinking things like communal and social unrest, different categories like repression, different categories like organized and interpersonal crime, different categories like intimate partner violence or interpersonal violence and domestic violence. And I think what COVID is doing, and what Clionadh's presentation shows, and what her data has been reflecting for years, is that these categories are somewhat arbitrary and that they're collapsing in some ways, in very complicated ways. That doesn't mean that they still don't have some poignancy and some conceptual power and some explanatory power. But I think it does come through that we're seeing the categories merge, and maybe the bureaucratic administrative communities of which the international agencies are a part are a bit slower to catch up to that, or are still stuck in a set of silos. And I think what's interesting too is that these different categories and types of violence, even as they merge, they do potentially require very different types of strategies to engage with. So we're really dealing with the struggle. In the case of conflict, we could see an acceleration, conflict between states and conflict within states, as a result of geopolitical wrangling between some of the great powers, between the distraction of the aid world, of a reduction in peacekeeping. We're already seeing that, right? Peacekeepers are being pulled out, and there's going to be greater reluctance among member states to deploy in a context where they could lose large numbers to sickness. That's going to affect the dynamics of conflict. But ditto with communal and social unrest, we're going to be seeing inequality, unemployment, food prices, supply chain fragmentation, probably contributing more to that kind of violence as well, which could also affect conflict. With repression, it comes down to bad government moves, prison outbreaks, the ways in which police are deployed, the ways in which people respond to COVID. That's going to have dynamics. And finally, with respect to crime, I've already mentioned the squeezing of drug markets, the smaller pie, the disequilibrium between groups. That's also going to have dynamics. So not only are these different categories coming together, and we're struggling, we're seeing that there's porosity between them, but also they're going to require different kinds of strategies. And that's complicated. Think of it as a 12-dimension matrix in the sky that every government's going to have to deal with. I'll stop there, Gary, and hand back to Clionadh.
Thanks. We're working on those 12 dimensions. Clionadh, let's go to you, and you can reflect a little bit on that, and then we'll come back. I've got some questions now that are coming in, and I'd like to be able to get to some of those.
Great, thank you very much. That's some excellent commentary. I really appreciate it. I just want to reiterate something that I think I do state maybe a bit too baldly sometimes. I think Gary is always taken aback by my impression that effectively conflict is not about grievance. So you are going to have a tremendous number of aggrieved people due to this pandemic, as you do generally. People are aggrieved. It's leading to tremendous populism movements, which in and of itself can become kind of violent depending on where they're set. If conflict isn't about grievance, and it is about opportunity and competitions for power, then as we tackle what is likely to come from the economic distortion due to the pandemic, we have to separate how we can provide for those who are aggrieved, very justifiably, from those that are violent. The problem is that when we combine policies as if these two communities are the same, we make bad policies. And those bad policies are not helping the aggrieved, and they're certainly not in any way dampening the violence. The violence is being generated from these groups that see themselves using this tool effectively to compete within a governance structure that has large-scale impunity, that effectively privileges violence. Now, yes, of course, there's riots, there's protests. We're seeing a tremendous amount of them. In a given state like India, it can make up 60% of the activity in a given week. But riots and protests aren't a huge concern to governments. I think we can see that from some of the social movements that occurred over the last 2 years. They can be prolonged. They can cause them to have some sort of international problems. They can effectively go from trying to mediate to being more repressive. But in no case have they been truly detrimental to what we're seeing. The Arab Spring was not detrimental to governments. If anything, it was detrimental to the society in which those people lived under. And so, coming back to what I'm trying to express about pandemics, let's keep those populations separate. We should, in fact, do whatever we can to protect the people who are likely to experience large-scale grievance and problems through the pandemic, and of course through the results of the pandemic, while at the same time having a much better strategy about how we're going to deal with violent political competition and armed group activity. Of course, the perspectives we have on domestic violence and on community violence are separate to this discussion, I think. And they truly are separate. They are often based on a completely different set of standards that we should be using for political violence. But what I'm worried about is that in all of my discussions about violence that I've attended over the years, there's so much of a push towards things like, can we estimate through AI the best way to indicate the exact place and moment that violence is going to break out? And for the life of me, I don't understand why we would do that. We're not very good at dealing with violence when we know where it is and we know what's happening. Why would we want to guess? Why would we want a model that tries to do it? It seems like we're not focusing on the real problems in these environments. If anything, we're exacerbating those problems.
Gary, one quick intervention just on that before we jump in. I do think it's important that we are clear on the separation of the different types of violence that we're speaking about and these categories. And I think different types of violence, as I was saying before, are going to be amenable to different types of policy interventions. And I think it's important to reflect on the vast burden of violence, certainly lethal violence, and Clionadh and I've gone back on this a couple of times, are happening outside of so-called conflict zones or areas where you have acute levels of political violence. Yes, there's a merging and there's a confusion and there's an overlap, and sometimes it's difficult to distinguish. But that, place and people often play a major role in the nature, the opportunity space, as it were, and the incentives for violence to take place. And I think one thing to reflect on is that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, to use that hackneyed phrase, in the context of COVID-19. This crisis will accentuate a set of challenges, but there is a lot of good practice and insight and lessons about how to lessen violence through the use of a combination of sticks and carrots, incentives, and all the rest, especially by focusing on areas where violence tends to concentrate and through very deliberate interventions. That's not to say that you can transfer violence designed to reduce, let's call it interpersonal crime and property crime on the street can be applied in the midst of a conflict zone. That's not what we're saying. But I do think it's important that the categorization is very clear, and sometimes it's not in these kinds of conversations, number one. Number two, that we reflect on the extraordinarily good practice that has actually contributed to dramatic declines in all manner of types of violence, certainly in the crime and intimate partner and interpersonal space over the last decade or two. So just a caution that COVID changes a lot, but it doesn't change everything.
I have my own caution, if I might. Yes, and then I know you've got questions. I think that one of the ways that we are thinking about dramatic declines in violence and crime is because we actually don't have those numbers to support it. If anything, we're seeing quite a lot, as I mentioned before, persistent, widespread, increasing low-level conflict. And that is with a tremendous amount of development initiatives and development successes. What my point has always been is that development and violence are not separate. They can co-occur within the same space. And our reactions to COVID, I'm just hoping, are not like our reactions to almost every other form of an emergency, which is to assume fragility, to bulk up some of the structures that are in fact quite violence-inducing in the first place, and then lay bare the vulnerabilities of these societies.
Great. We're going to get back to data in just a minute. I have some questions that have come in, and they're very, very linked to what you just said, both of you, Clionadh and Rob. I totally agree with you, Clionadh. I mean, I think that when we talk about grievance, we have to remember that that's the fuel. But there are people that manipulate and use violence to be able to achieve ends. And those are the people that are the spark in the fire that is violence, right? And so what this data points to, and I think your recommendations 4 and 5, Rob, when you're thinking about acting locally, about working with networks and systems that work on the ground. And we have a lot of peace builders that are going to be having sessions over the next 2 weeks talking about this. It's very much about identifying the places where this actually works, where the fabric still exists, where counterparts are there. They're the ones that are doing the real hard work on the ground, trying to promote peace. And how can we, the international community that now can't travel in most of these places, how can we actually support that? How can our data help to be able to support that? So I think that gives us a good opportunity to pivot right now, which is to quickly reflect on, we have a couple of questions that came in, which were about aid, which were about food security and food assistance, which were about debt relief. And so I think what I hear you both saying, and if we could keep these answers short, we'll be able to get to the next question, which is, we can't solve these things at the global level in headquarters. What we really need to do is use this expanded and better data that we have now to be able to measure and monitor violence and understand that it's different in every one of these contexts. We're getting better data, and that we can't use these broad brush responses to solve these problems. Can we dive a little bit more deeply into that and say, what does that look like? If I agree with you, Rob, we don't have an analog. We shouldn't assume that there's an analog for focused deterrence for promoting peace building in developing countries. But clearly, there are some examples. There are some metaphors that we can use that help us to be able to move that forward a little bit. So, how do we act locally and avoid the traps of repeating those mistakes that Clionadh has pointed out?
I'll be very brief. I mean, I think that mindful of all of the challenges, the complexities, the deficits, and the crunch that we're all going to feel, and governments around the world are going to feel in terms of austerity, I think the imperative here has to be really around making very smart moves. Smart moves that are, to the best extent possible, data-driven, to the extent possible that are based on good evidence, although I appreciate that we have to be incredibly careful about moves that could exacerbate violence. And I made that point, I think, fairly emphatically in my concluding comments. So the imperative right now, more than ever, is we have to do more with less, and interventions need to have multiple benefits rather than a single one. And this is a challenge, and it's going to force a lot of us to be quite disciplined in terms of the kinds of recommendations we move. Number two, we have to recognize that we can't let perfection be the enemy of the good. And that may sound counterintuitive or contradictory to what I just said, but I think that if we get things too perfect, this crisis and the knock-on effects is moving rapidly. The second wave will be more dramatic, I think, than the first, if the epidemiologists are to be believed. And so there needs to be some decisiveness in some of the moves as well. The third bit is the tricky one, which is, I think, and we've been talking about this for many years, trying to get our architectures to think more locally in terms of how aid is supplied and provided. And this means working through subnational institutions. We're not going nearly far enough. I mean, there's been a big shift in the last couple of years to think about urbanization and the role of cities and the role of states below the national level and their particular role. And there are experiments here and there and some increasing work streams in the bank and in the UN and elsewhere to work directly with subnational units. But we need to get much smarter about how do we work with our local authorities, our mayors, our city planners, our civic leaders, our faith-based groups, our grassroots activists, and find modalities that can move transfer support. And at a very weedy level, that means thinking differently about our procurement and using technology to fast track, in a way, some support. But again, there's so much risk here because of the challenges that Clionadh emphasized and that we all know very well, which is that this can actually distort the opportunity structure and the incentive structure locally. And so, I think getting local, getting smarter about our evidence, fast-tracking support, these are the kinds of activities, I think. And one final point is to mention, we're seeing a lot of really exciting innovation happening at that sub-national scale, especially the metropolitan and municipal scale. A lot of the most interesting activities are happening. Why? Because the level of trust tends to be stronger between local residents and their locally elected or, in some cases, appointed officials. That doesn't apply to all places. It's going to be radically different from place to place when you've seen capture of these local institutions by armed groups, which is happening. But finding ways to build on that trust, that legitimacy, that credibility that exists, I think is often very important. But the final point here is really about politics and engaging politics much more fulsomely than we have. There is still a reticence, and I still hear it in webinars that I'm going to these days, in large international institutions, that we don't do politics. Somehow there's still this idea that aid is this technocratic exercise. And this is, we get it. There are statutory limitations, there are challenges, there's member states that get anxious. But if we don't deal in a really coherent and comprehensive way with those politics locally, and get smarter about that, then we risk doing exactly what Clionadh warns us not to do, which is to inflame local tensions rather than to find ways to address and quell them.
Clionadh, let's turn to you. We have two questions that are extraordinarily relevant here, and I don't expect you to be able to answer them in what we have left, the time that we have left. But people are asking, can we make peace processes with cartels? Can we negotiate with drug lords? There are limits to where our models that we have used in the past can be applied locally. What do you think, Clionadh? Where should we be focusing our efforts?
One of the benefits of the last few years has been my expectations are now so low as to what I can expect from governance that a cartel member might, in fact, really be an upstanding citizen from where I can stand. Okay, so typically the way you get rid of cartels is to have them kill each other, to be totally frank. But that may not necessarily be our options in this case. And the other ways is to legitimate them as some sort of local governor. And there is a tremendous amount of literature within, especially the Latin American space, which is a discussion about subnational authoritarianism. But I think that what we would need to do more than anything else is to acknowledge the trade-offs. As Rob says, you cannot let the good be the enemy of the perfect, be the enemy of the good, rather. It's a real complete turnaround from the types of development that we've been taught to really appreciate, which is to build national structures, to have all of the regions within a country be compliant within those national institutions, to build some sort of, let's say, decentralization and some sort of response and distributive mechanisms throughout the country. What we're basically saying is, like, let's break these things up. If they're not capable of distributing at the national level the security and the goods and effectively the citizenship that we would expect from these governments, let's distribute it locally. I mean, that's also going to be a mess. But it would get rid of our most current problem, which is what I think is a massive amount of capture in the center, which is effectively starving the local from being able to build itself up as a political unit. It's a long.
Thank you. No, that was a fantastic answer, and I think it's right. And I think what we're counting on is that the peace builders that are watching this, and we've depressed them horribly this afternoon, and I'm very sorry about that, but they're all professionals and they've been working in this field for a long time. And in many cases, it's refreshing, I think, for them to see you also shrugging at some of those problems, Clionadh, because they likewise have been banging their head against this for years. I'm going to come back to you in a minute with an opportunity for you to say something positive or hopeful about the future to kind of bring us out. I want to just quickly acknowledge that the GReVD Consortium, if we could show the last slide, the GReVD Consortium is a partnership among 12 different institutions, 2 of which are represented here today. That's Igarapé and ACLED. But we have convened with support, very generous support for the first year here to launch us, with support from the Swedish Postcode Foundation, to bring us together to help us solve a lot of these problems that are associated with violent deaths, and bring together the community that's working on this so that we have an accurate count going forward. And I will close there with my part. I'll quickly go to you, Rob and Clionadh. Tell us something that we can take away from this Is there something in the future that we can look forward to, or something that'll come out of this that's positive that can help us close the session?
Well, I gave a couple of positive thoughts at the end of my talk, but I do think there are a couple of big red flags on the horizon, notably the wrangling between China and the U.S., which is changing the game, the move towards protectionism and tariffs as we get more nationalistic and populist. That really worries me. And frankly, another black swan. I mean, in the course of this COVID crisis, there have been other infectious disease outbreaks that we've seen from the Philippines to Brazil. And that's just pandemics or epidemics or disease. The one final thing I'll say on a positive note, though, I think Clionagh's work, Gary, and your work, and others who are listening's work, is the extraordinary ingenuity, creativity and innovation that's been unleashed in this time. I mean, there has been 30,000 research papers shared on the science of COVID. There's been an unbelievable explosion of use of new digital tools to think about how to get better contact tracing and telemedicine and thinking about work. There's huge creativity happening at the city scale as cities rethink and reimagine their spaces in a way that doesn't just deal with pandemic issues, but deals with climate and deals with inclusivity and all the rest. So there is an opportunity here, I think, for capturing that and building on it and coming up with amazing and wild interventions. But I do want to say one final thing, which is that the next couple of months and years are going to be critical. We will see $1 trillion dividends potentially if we have $1 billion investments now. And so I think it's really important that we see some kind of global cooperation and coming together to find ways to harness that ingenuity if we want to see some positive dividends down the road. So trying to end on a positive note, but over to you, Clionadh.
As Gary knows, I'm not big on positivity, but I'll give it a try. The first thing I would say is that we don't have, it's not quite like 1918 in the sense that we don't have an active war that we are all necessarily dragging in quite a lot of the most developed states yet. But I will actually say that the most positive thing about this is what ACLED has known for the entirety of its existence is that there is tremendous ingenuity and passion and loyalty to the practitioners that will actually come up with these solutions. It's fine for me to say here and say, well, there's subnational this and there's subnational that, but it's down to the people who are living and working in these places to actually solve some of the most difficult challenges, whether it is conflict risk or health risks or risks of political repression. The fact that they can both endure it, but also look beyond it to see the best in their own communities is something that I think that we just have to do everything we can to support, rather than make it more difficult for them at the international and national level.
Absolutely. We are here to support. We can't solve it all in an hour-long conversation, but I very much appreciate you giving us this overview, Rob and Clionadh, and for CIPRI making this possible. We're looking forward to the next 2 weeks of conversations where you're going to identify those solutions in all of these sessions and discussions, and we all need to double down. We all need to work harder, and this is going to be a critical moment. So let's invest in that peace building that Rob mentioned. And thank you very much, Clionadh. Thank you very much, Rob. Really appreciate the conversation. Look forward to continuing it online.